First of all, I'm glad you're here, and so thank you for braving the elements and taking the time to come when it may be very, very true that everything inside you said, you know what, maybe I shouldn't, maybe I don't have to, some of you didn't, but you're watching on YouTube, and so if that's you, thanks for joining us. Some of you are realizing now, wait a second, I didn't have to come. I could have watched this on my computer. Yeah, sorry. And what's funny is, so this is, first of all, I guess fair warning. Since you did come and you took the opportunity to be here this morning, then first of all, the passage that we're going to go through this morning, you are here for a reason. And you came this morning, and so what you are going to hear this morning, whether you think so or not, you're supposed to hear. And so there is something in here for you. The reason I say that is because this is not exactly the most popular passage that is in the Bible. We're going to be in 1 Peter chapter 3 this morning. 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 to 7. If you're using one of the Bibles that we provided in the back, it's on page 1569 still. But next week, we're going to flip the page in the Bibles in the back. So page 1569. 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 to 7 is where we're going to be. Not because of the snow. I thought about skipping this morning. I don't know if when you get there, if you've read ahead to the passage that we're going to be studying this morning. I'm guessing you didn't because you still came. But this is why I gave the message. If you look at your notes, this is why I gave the message a weird title. So you wouldn't see what we're talking about and then walk right back out the door and say, yeah, I'm not. But you came, and so you're stuck. Today's passage may be one of the more unpopular passages in the Bible. And let's just say this. Nobody is putting 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 1 on a coffee mug. So they can see it every morning, right? Or they're not making those decals that you put on your kitchen wall of 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 1. Or there's no you're not going to find a calendar in a Christian bookstore somewhere that's got a beautiful nature scene behind it, right? With this verse on it for January. And some of you are thinking, "Oh man, what did I walk into?" Or some of you just turned off the YouTube video. I'll be honest with you, I'm thinking the same thing. What did I? This is the beauty or the danger of doing exegetical preaching, which means we go verse by verse through books. Is that the beauty of it is that you can't avoid hard passages. The downside to it is you can't avoid hard passages or verses like that. So if you're thinking it, I'm thinking it. So we're just going to rip the Band-Aid off together, and I hope to show you how to properly understand this passage and what we can learn and apply from it. And like I said before, you came this morning. There's something here for you, and I'm convinced of it. And so you may look at verse 1 and think, well, I'm not a wife. Or later on, I'm not a husband. But I believe that there is something that we can all learn and apply from this, not just husbands and wives. And so I would encourage you, keep your mind open as you listen to this. And I'll also say this, I'm not sure there's ever a pastor anywhere that ever feels qualified to teach these verses. So don't think that, that I'm coming this from anything but, man, did I learn a lot this week. So this is going to be 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 to 7, page 1569 in the Bibles that we have provided. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 1 to 7 says this: Wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives. When they see the purity and reverence of their lives, your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as elaborate hairstyles and the wearing of gold jewelry or fine clothes. Rather, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. For this is the way the holy women of the past who put their hope in God used to adorn themselves. They submitted themselves to their own husbands, like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham and called him her Lord. You are her daughters if you do what is right and do not give way to fear. Husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives and treat them with respect as the weaker partner and as heirs with you of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. So the first thing I want to say about these 7 verses is that there are parts of these verses that are ripped out of context all the time. And I think that's really important to remember, that So this passage may be, apart from I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, this may be one of the most ripped out of context verses in the Bible. We can talk about the Philippians passage later on. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. You can't fly. You can try, but you won't be able to. But it's a nice thought. But first, I would say, so these are ripped out of context, specifically these phrases. I'm going to tell you the phrases that are ripped out of context. Wives, submit to your husbands. We pull this out of context all the time, and like I said, nobody's putting on their coffee mugs. Or your beauty shouldn't come from elaborate hairstyles and jewelry. We rip that out of context a lot, and we make misapplication of it. Or in verse 7 where it says, treat them as the weaker vessels. And some of you are like, weaker vessel? You haven't been in my house. But I'll say context is everything. And that means understanding how these verses make sense, taking into account the lessons and verses around them, and also putting them in the bigger picture of what the Bible says as a whole on this issue. It's very important that we do that, because when we don't, we misunderstand. And so before we wade into the deep end on this one, I want to show you a passage that I think will help our understanding of this one. It's not here in 1 Peter, though. So in his letter to the church in Corinth, Greece, Paul spends 2 chapters talking a lot about the various aspects of marriage. And then he gets to this section where he addresses people who aren't married. And I think there he gives us some really great insight that will help us get a good starting point for our passage. So before we talk about marriage, let's talk about unmarriage. It's 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 32 and 33, and then through 35, actually. So Paul says this to people who aren't married. I would like you to be free from concern. An unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs, how he can please the Lord. But a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife, and his interests are divided. An unmarried woman or virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit. But a married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world, how she can please her husband. I'm saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, but that you may live in a right way, and I think this phrase is very important, in undivided devotion to the Lord. In undivided devotion to the Lord. So the point here, and the reason I show you these verses, the point that Paul is making is that when you aren't married as a Christian, your undivided attention is on how can I please God. When you aren't married as a Christian, your undivided attention is on how can I please God? How can I please God with my finances? How can I please God with this decision? How can I please God with my time? How can I please God? Everything as a Christian, when you aren't married, is yours to decide how can I best please God with this. However, when you get married, your attention is naturally divided. It's divided. Things get a little bit more complicated, or in some cases a lot more complicated. Paul isn't saying that marriage is wrong. He's saying that marriage is tricky. Marriage gets tricky. And when you're single, you make decisions only about yourself. You're not affected by anyone else and how your decisions affect them. And so it's relatively easy to keep every decision and every aspect of your life devoted and focused to God. I say relatively easy because we know keeping my focus on God is not necessarily always an easy thing, but it's easier than if you were married. It's because when you're married, all of that changes. This is why I encourage teenagers that from these verses, if you haven't figured out how to devote your decisions and time to God already, then you have no business dating, because your decisions and your time will be divided. And it becomes that much harder. We are a distraction for each other from God. Not just in general, people are a distraction for each other from God. So Paul's point really is marriage naturally divides your devotion. It divides your attention, and it makes things significantly more complicated in your ability to worship God. There are added dimensions for decisions, for emotions, for relationships, and there is also an increased possibility and dimension of suffering when you add somebody else to the equation. And some of you may be able to attest to that more than others, that when you add another person in that situation, the possibility for suffering also increases as well. It may be extreme and it may be subtle, because your attention is divided and you're distracted, and most significantly because the potential for conflict increases in those situations. Whether it's necessary or unnecessary conflict, or cruel or harmless conflict, that's more of a possibility and potential in marriage. Which is why Paul says, look, for someone who's not married, your devotion is undivided, your attention is on God. The possibility for that conflict, that suffering, it's not nearly as much there. And so if you remember, though, that has been the theme of Peter's letter that we're looking at this morning, that suffering is a reality we live with, and we would probably be honest if we were saying that suffering in marriage is also a reality that we live with, because conflict is there. It's not as easy as when you're not. And you'll notice that Peter starts chapter 3, context is everything, verse 1, the ones that we read earlier, with wives in the same way. Context is everything. The verse doesn't say, wives, submit to your husbands. The verse says, wives, in the same way, submit. Context is important. In the same way that we submit to a government who doesn't share our values or opposes our beliefs, right? In the same way that an employee submits to an unjust or incompetent boss, things that we've been talking about the last few weeks, in the same way that Christ submitted and died in our place for our sins on the cross, wives, in the same way, submit to your own husbands. So it seems clear in the context to me when I read this that the wives he's writing to specifically in their situation in this letter are in a difficult marriage. He's been writing to people who experience suffering, who are experiencing suffering. They're suffering under an unjust government. They're suffering under an unjust boss. He's using Christ who suffered under persecution, and he's saying, wives, in the same way, submit. She's in a difficult marriage. He might not share her values. He might seem to her unrespectable. He might seem or be unjust in his treatment of her. In fact, in Peter's example, if you look at the end of verse 1, in Peter's example, he's not a believer. Submit yourselves to your own husbands so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over. And so at least for one of the women that he's writing to, her husband's not a believer, and she is. So this is important to remember so that we don't take this out of context, that we don't clench up and get upset when we read 1 Peter 3:1, wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands so that they may be won over. So now, before you start calling me a chauvinist, let me explain what we're looking at here, because I actually think it's really neat how this works. And guys, your turn is coming. We're getting to verse 7, so put your elbow back where it belongs. I said a couple of minutes ago that this is ripped out of context, so let me tell you what this doesn't mean. Let me tell you what this doesn't mean. 1 Peter 3:1, I want you to be very clear what this doesn't mean. It doesn't mean that women have to submit to every man. You read it. Wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands. This doesn't mean that women have to submit to every man. It says submit to your own husbands. That's a very specific relationship. That is not all men. It's really important that you know that. Does anyone else smell hot dogs? No? All right, just me. This isn't all men, sorry. It also doesn't mean that men are better than women. It doesn't say that. It doesn't mean that men are better than women or that women are inferior or unequal. It's not what it means. Right? Genesis chapter 1, verse 27 makes it really clear that when God made Adam and Eve, when he created them, and he created them in his own image, in the image of God, he created them male and female. He created both of them in his image with equality, right? Equally in his image, equally with the same value, equally with the same dignity. Galatians 3:28, which we've been coming back to a few different times now, says that there is neither Jew or Gentile, slave or free, nor is there male or female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Everyone has the same value, dignity, equality in God's eyes, right? Based on his gift of life to everyone. Men are not superior to women. And he's going to reinforce that. Peter is going to reinforce this down in verse 7 when he talks about us being equal heirs to the gift of life. This is not saying that men in any way are better than women. This is not that. Also, it doesn't mean that a husband should force submission. This is not saying that a husband should force submission. The act of submission here is reflexive. What I mean by that is she's doing it. Look in verse 1. Wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands. The submission is your choice. The responsibility is yours to follow the instruction of God. Nowhere does it say, husbands, you have the right to walk around and say, woman, submit. It doesn't say that. Your submission, ladies, is yours to voluntarily offer, though Peter is saying you should make that choice. You should voluntarily offer it. But our culture has really taken this word submission and given it a really negative connotations. So you're not going to find any of these ideas of submission supported in the Bible. Right? Women do not have to submit to every man. It doesn't mean that men are better than women. It doesn't mean that a husband can force submission. And it also doesn't mean that you have the right, that you have to give in to every whim and every crazy idea that happens. The idea that the man gets to decide and women are just along for the ride is wrong. Some people point to Genesis 3:16 where it says that Eve, your desire will be for your husband and he's going to rule over you. They point to Genesis 3:16 and say, well, the husband is to rule over the wife, or worse, men are to rule over women. But it's a misunderstanding of a word that means to lead and guide. And that's also forgetting that the Bible makes it clear that the way Jesus rules the church, is the example for husbands to treat their wives. This isn't lording over anyone. And it doesn't mean you have to give in to every single whim that's out there. It also absolutely, and please hear this, it absolutely doesn't mean taking abuse or being a doormat. That's not submission. It doesn't mean taking abuse or being a doormat. That's not this word. This word has everything to do with a respectful partnership. It's not biblical for you to just take the abuse that is heaped on you, especially if it's physical. That's not this. Submission here is deferring. It's following, but in a partnership. And so I can best describe it to you this way. As it like a head coach and an assistant coach. Both are vitally important and must have a relationship, right, of respect and communication. But when it comes to decision time, the assistant coach defers to the head coach, follows the head coach. And if the head coach is smart, they know what they don't know, and making the best decision often means listening to the assistant coach. That's what this is. That's what this submission means. That's the submission we're talking about. The submission here is best understood as a partnership where ultimately someone has to make the decision, be the leader, and go out in front. And biblically, God has designed that person to be the husband, to be the one to ultimately go out in front. Ephesians 5:22 and 23 says the same. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. And so at some point, biblically, God designed it so that the husband will have to make the decision. But this is head coach, assistant coach, right? Where there's a partnership there, and that ultimately there's respect and communication with equal roles on both sides, and both have a responsibility and accountability to God. Now, Peter gives us then a very positive way to look at a wife's submission. Despite the negative situation, and he gives a very specific instruction for how to do it. So Peter's going to take this, and he's going to turn it very positive. I want you to look at this positively, and here's how you can do it. So 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 1, again, wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives. What Peter says is submit in a way that if they don't believe, they will be won over. Submit in a way, be a partner in a way that if they don't believe in God, that they will be won over. Meaning there is a positive way to approach biblical submission. because it has a purpose, and it has a focus, and it has nothing to do, hear this, it has nothing to do with making your husband happy. Right? It's to win him over to God. There's a focus, there's a purpose for biblical submission. It has nothing to do with making your husband happy and everything to do with winning him over to God. In fact, what we've read over the last few weeks is that if we are submitting for the purpose of pleasing a government or pleasing our boss, that's idolatry. We shouldn't care or want them to be happy with us. We should want God to be happy with us. And if we're submitting to please our government, it's idolatry. If we're submitting to please our boss, it's idolatry. If you're submitting to please your husband, it's idolatry. We don't submit for them. If you're submitting to please your husband, that's a misplaced focus. You should be submitting with the purpose and focus of winning him over to God. It's an act of worship to God and to please him only. That's why Peter says in verse 5, this is the way the holy women of the past who put their hope in God used to adorn themselves. They put their hope in God. He gives us examples of women who biblically submitted, and it says that they did it because their hope was in God. They were focusing on God. And a wife's submission to her husband, even if he doesn't share her values, it has everything to do with pushing him closer to God, pushing him closer to God. Because if he doesn't believe, then her submission may win him over to God. And if he does believe, then her submission may win him over to God. It doesn't, even if he does believe, the principle is still the same. The submission pushes him closer to God. If he doesn't believe, maybe he will be won over. And if he does believe, you're still pushing him closer to God that much more. So that's the focus. That's the purpose. That's the thing to keep in mind. This isn't for him. Right? I'm not doing this to please my husband. I'm not doing this to please government or what. I'm doing this to please God, and I want to push them closer to God. That's the point. Chapter 2, verse 12 says, live such good lives among them that even if they accuse you of wrong deeds, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. We want to be worshiping side by side with them someday. And so it has everything to do with pushing the people around us, whether it's our husband, whether it's the government, whether it's our wife, whether it's anybody, it's pushing them towards God. That should be our focus, that they may be won over towards God. And so according to Peter, how do you then become a biblical partner and an assistant coach? How do you biblically submit if that's the focus? And so first you need to hear this. There is no way. And I'm going to say the same thing here about husbands in a moment. There is no way a wife can come under her husband's leadership, especially a lost man who doesn't submit himself to God. There's no way you're going to be able to do that unless Jesus has done a work in your heart. There's no way. And I'm going to say the same thing to us in a minute. There is no way you're going to be able to do that without God doing a work through the Holy Spirit in your heart. So being a biblical partner and an assistant coach, submission means this, verse 2. When they see the purity and reverence of your lives, your beauty should not come from outward adornment such as elaborate hairstyles and the wear of gold jewelry or fine clothes. It should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. Biblical submission means living a life of purity, reverence, and gentleness in spirit. This will push your husband towards God. This will push anyone around you towards God. And by consequence, that will also push them towards godly decisions. It'll also push them towards godly actions. And so what I mean by that is, first, your consistency in how you live your life and who you are and your love for God gains you leverage and credibility. The consistency with how you live your life biblically, how you love God, gains you leverage and credibility with the person you're hoping to push towards God. And so live your life in purity and with reverence to God. And second, the gentle spirit with which you approach issues and decisions and conflict will win the day. Notice I didn't say, let him decide. Right? The gentle spirit with which you approach the issues, with which you approach the decisions, with which you approach the conflict, that will win the day. And ladies, I hope you see here This doesn't take away input. This doesn't take away influence. Actually, it gives you a prescription for how to make a guy think he's deciding when really you're the one deciding, with a gentle spirit, right? A gentle whisper, not and influencing and handling that conflict. Right? Consistently live a pure life and love God, and then gently approach the issue and conflict. And so to illustrate this, Peter uses a seemingly odd example to illustrate this whole live a life of purity, right? Revere God, be gentle and quiet in your spirit. He uses an odd example, and it's an example, again, as most of this passage is, it's been oddly taken out of context. It's there in verses 3 and 4. Right? He says, so your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as elaborate hairstyles and the wearing of gold jewelry or fine clothes. Rather, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's eyes. And so some people have taken this to mean that you shouldn't braid, because some of your versions talk about braiding the hair, right? So some people have taken this to say, well, you shouldn't braid your hair and you shouldn't wear jewelry. That's not what this is saying. That's not what this is saying. Here's what it's saying, and this is why I think Peter uses this example. Ladies, it is very easy to manipulate men. Let's just be honest. It's very easy to manipulate men. It's very easy to glam things up and flutter your eyelids. And I don't even know what the ratio is, but that's got to be favoring women. When police pull you over, if I flutter my eyes at them, I'm still getting the ticket. If you flutter your eyes at them, you have a much better chance. It's easy to manipulate men, right? It's easy to glam things up, flutter your eyes, and control or avoid the conflict. It's easy, and it might win the decision, and it might win the conversation. The truth is, it's far easier to put on some makeup than it is to work on godliness. It's way easier to put on makeup than it is to work towards godliness, to work on living life in purity and reverence and developing a gentle spirit. But what does your husband need more? Godliness. What do the people around you need more? Godliness. They don't need manipulation. They need godliness. They need to be won over to God, not won over to you. Won over to God and pushed towards God, not to you. So work more on making your life more beautiful than your body. But also don't just roll out of bed and not brush your teeth because morning breath is gross. So you can brush your teeth. All right. So ladies, we're done. Guys, it's our turn. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 7. Husbands, in the same way be considerate as you live with your wives and treat them with respect as the weaker partner and as heirs with you of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. So again, don't forget the context. Notice how he starts verse 7 is the same way he started verse 1. In the same way. In the same way. In the same way that your wife should pursue godliness and push you to godliness. With that same motivation. With that same purpose, you should be pushing people towards godliness around you, specifically your wife. Now, what is interesting here is that men only get one verse. However, biblically, when you read the Bible, there is a lot more expected of the husband. In fact, even in this one verse, there are more commands than there were in the last 6 verses. There's more responsibility. First thing, though, that Peter says is, in the same way, be considerate. Be considerate. The ESV, the English Standard Version, has the best translation of this. It says, live with your wives in an understanding way. Live with your wives in an understanding way. This means know them. Know their desires, know their goals, know their frustrations, know their strengths, know their weaknesses. Sons, know your moms. Know your sisters. Know them, understand them. Know their strengths and weaknesses and their goals, and know those things about them, because by understanding them and living in an understanding way with people, we push them towards God. See, guys, we have a problem. We think our way is the best all the time. And we think that we know best all the time, and we like to just kind of put our foot down and push people around. But when you know people and you're considerate and you live in a considerate way, you start to push them towards God because you know what works and what doesn't work, and it's not always just your way, and this works best with your wife. Know her. Study her, and live in a way that shows that you get her, you understand her, you consider her with your decisions and your choices. And this is really hard. This is really hard. See, Adam and Eve lived for a long time, a really long time, and I'm guessing there were still times towards the end where Eve got mad and Adam had no idea why. I don't know why you're mad right now. I don't. And we've been living for like 300 years, and I'm still lost. Or he was thinking, I have no idea why we're hugging right now, but bring it in. I don't know why. I don't get this. I'm not sure why you're crying, but just get in here. Let's hug. This is hard to understand, right? Personally, I don't understand the fascination with figure skating. And I don't think I ever will understand the fascination with figure skating, but I know there is, right, a fascination with figure skating. But Peter says I have to try. You have to try. I need to be understanding and know those strengths and weaknesses and everything that is affecting there. I need to be. I need to be understanding when my wife gently comes to me and says, with a gentle, quiet spirit, she disagrees with something I've said or done. I need to be understanding about how hard that is and what she's saying, right? I'm so bad at this, but we need to be good at this. He says that I need to be considerate that it's not easy for a wife to always have to be an assistant coach. It's not easy. Peter says that I need to live, I need to decide, I need to act in the most understanding and knowing way possible. Be considerate with how you live. And then he says this, give them honor and respect as the weaker vessel, verse 7. Treat them with respect as the weaker partner, right? Give them honor as the weaker vessel. So this statement gets a lot of flack too, right? And some of you are thinking, I'm weaker vessel. I'm not weaker partner. What Peter is not saying, again, is that women are inferior to men. We already covered that. He's not saying that women are inferior to men. This is what I think he's saying. He's saying that men are like metal buckets. Men are like metal buckets, and we take a beating, we take abuse, but women, or your wife, they're to be treated like porcelain, like fine china. Right? In the sense that they have significant value and a special purpose. Know them, understand them, and treat them like that. Take the brunt and the beating of life and give them the value and dignity they deserve. You're the metal bucket. They're the fine china. Treat them like it. Take the brunt of life. Ephesians 5:25 calls this love. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Give yourself up for them. Sacrifice for the hurt and the pain and the frustration. It's self-sacrificing love. I'm going to give in. I'm going to get hurt. I'm going to make myself low to treat you with honor and respect and push you towards God. Which means sometimes the head coach makes a decision that benefits the assistant coach, not him. Because I'm the metal bucket, and you're the fine china. And hopefully you're seeing the partnership there. The partnership between these two. There's no one that's better than the other. Right? This is a partnership. It's not a domineering relationship. This isn't degrading to women, and it's not emasculating to men. That's not what this is. But the only way, again, we can do this is if Jesus has done a work in our heart. Ladies, men, this is how we treat anybody. The only way we can treat anyone with the respect and dignity they deserve is if Jesus has done a work in our hearts. It just becomes that much more difficult when you're married. Men, when we don't do this, you see this at the end of verse 7. They're equal heirs with us as the gracious gift of life. Do this so that nothing will hinder your prayers. When we don't do this, it pulls us away from God, which only makes sense. It doesn't just pull us away from God, it pulls them away from God. And women, when you don't do this, it pulls you away from God. It pulls them away from God. If we're so focused on micromanaging women and asserting our dominance and being a tough guy and demanding our way, and that's our approach to everything, then we're giving her a really poor picture of God and pushing her away. And we're going to take that dominant attitude with God too, and we're going to take it with him too, right? I'm going to be domineering and pushy with God too, and that doesn't work. It doesn't work. No matter who it is, no matter what relationship it is, we should be pushing each other towards God. That becomes that much more difficult in a marriage. And so in order to accomplish that, ladies, live your life in purity and reverence towards God, and then use a gentle, quiet spirit, and you will win them over to God. And that'll work with a lot of people, not just your husband. And men, be considerate and understand in the way that you live, and that'll work with anyone, not just your wife. And our goal, ultimately, is to live so well among people that we may end up worshiping God side by side with them. So men, we need to be more understanding of everyone. Ladies, live life so well that gives you leverage and credibility, and approach those things with gentleness. But remember 1 Corinthians chapter 7, we looked at it at the beginning, 1 Corinthians 7, verses 32 to 35, that whole part there where Paul talks about unmarried people. How distracting is everything I just described, having to work through those relationships and work through how to be quiet and gentle and how to be considerate and loving with how I live my life, and how distracting is all of that. We are going to be a distraction from God. We cause divided devotion. Not just in marriage, but in all of life, we distract each other from God. And so in a world of suffering, where suffering and conflict is unavoidable, we must live in a way that pushes each other towards God. We must live in a way that pushes each other towards God. So that starts with you individually, with your own personal relationship with God, and making sure that you are devoted to him. That's where this starts, with you as an individual, making sure that you are devoted to him, because none of this works if Jesus doesn't rule your heart. Then taking that relationship and devotion and live all of life in light of that, so that life is an act of worship to God and no one else. So that I'm not seeking to please the government. I'm not seeking to please my boss. I'm not seeking to please my wife or my husband. I am doing this to please God. All of life is an act of worship to him. So if you aren't married, you have none of that distraction. You can devote everything you have to God. And in that sense, you should have an easier time effectively worshiping God with your life. It doesn't make it easier, but it gives you purpose. It gives all of us purpose for how we live life. So, wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands in that partnership. And husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives. But in everything, push each other towards God. That's the goal, to push each other towards God. Let's pray. God, I thank you for forcing us to confront maybe uncomfortable things or issues that we don't always like to think about or want to hear or talk about. But would you help us to see how in every relationship that we have, how we have the possibility, the potential, and where we can act in a way that worships you and pushes that person towards God, whether it's a friend or a coworker or a parent or a child or a husband or wife or whoever it might be. God, will you help us live life in such a way that pushes that person closer to you, because we love you and we love them in light of you. Please help us to work that into our lives and take away those things where maybe we are pulling instead of pushing. And I pray this in your name.